Hi and welcome back to Police Stories podcast. This is episode 25, a series of short stories about my 28-year career, roughly, in the UK police force across various forces, 3 different forces and different sort of specialist units, which we'll get onto. And I'm taking this pretty much as my career came. So at this point in my career, I must have been about 3 years in, something like that. And up until now, I've been doing, the normal police work, normal response stuff, answering the 999 calls and enjoying it. I'd had probably 6 months to a year maybe on the tutor unit, so looking after the new guys and girls that were coming in and sort of bringing them on and getting them up to a standard. Now, already at this point in my career, I knew that I wasn't going to stay on response, the sort of normal uniform policing, the whole time. Some people do, and that's absolutely fine. Everyone's different, and that is the beauty of the police. It has so much range. It doesn't matter what you want to do within the police. Chances are you can do it, no matter what your interest is. And sometimes when you join, you don't really know. So you'll start off, and while you're dealing with things through your daily sort of policing, you'll see a unit, whether that's firearms, diving, marine unit, close protection, CID detectives, scenes of crime stuff. There could be all sorts. And while you're dealing with, those sort of jobs that come up, you'll have a look at something, get chatting to maybe one of them and think, do you know what, that looks like a cracking job. I fancy a bit of that. So what happens within the police is much like other organisations, I'm sure, they advertise internal jobs. Obviously, invariably you have to be a police officer, within that force to apply for all these jobs. But, all these units have to advertise and continue their recruitment. Obviously, they have natural wastage, so they have people retiring out of the job and leaving and promoting and what have you. So that leaves positions. Now, some jobs are, dead man's shoes, as they're called. You basically have to wait until someone pretty much dies off, before you're going to get a shot at that unit, depending on how big it is and how big your force is. So it can be frustrating if there's a job you really want to do, but there's only, 5 people in that force that do it. It's a very limited opportunity. And also what happens is as you get promoted, so those opportunities, stop. When I was on the marine unit, there was maybe 80 PCs at one point, 80 sort of cops and perhaps 10 sergeants and 1 inspector, So you can imagine if you're a sergeant, straight away there's now only 10 spaces for you. If you're an inspector, there's literally 1 opportunity for you to get onto that unit. So you pretty much have to make a decision, do you want promotion or do you want sort of specialist units? Now, of course, a lot of people do the specialist units to start with, and then as they get promoted, they've kind of move on to the management side of it, which ultimately, as you go up through the ranks, you become less and less a police officer and more a manager. It is about, like other businesses, managing budgets and resources. And that's no different in the police. So certainly when you get to the higher echelons, unless it's a really, really high profile case, you're not actually going to get involved on a sort of policing level. But anyway, so police advertise these jobs and everyone gets an opportunity. Now, when I tell people about my career, just in normal sort of day-to-day chatting, and you sort of, they ask, well, what did you do? And you say, well, I did this and I did that. People go, wow, you're really lucky. You had such a varied career. Well, that is true to a degree, but I can tell you none of those units came knocking at my door. You have to put in a considerable amount of effort to get on those units. And then there's invariably, quite a few courses you have to pass, and then you have to continuation training, and continue to refresh and pass courses as time goes on, because otherwise you either don't get to them in the first place or you will get binned out of that unit fairly quickly, if you're not up to the standard. And you can imagine that's really important on, say, the dive team or firearms. You can't have someone who isn't up to the standard. So I would keep an eye on these adverts that would come out, for internal jobs, just to sort of see what was about, really. And I never really thought I would be applying for too much, because I didn't really know how it works. You've got to remember I'm kind of 24 at this point, something like that, with maybe 3 or 4 years in. So I was still pretty naive in the policing world. But I saw an advert come up for a surveillance course, a 3-week surveillance course. And although it was advertised within the force, they said there was an opportunity to go on to potential sort of national surveillance jobs. Now, it's not something I'd really thought about, and lots of people envisage it, wow, that'd be really exciting, surveillance, sneaking around and all that. And it is true, there is a lot of sneaking around, that's the nature of the beast. But the vast majority of surveillance is kind of sat in a car or sat in a bush, or sat in, somebody's home address somewhere, looking out of a window for hours and hours on end with absolutely nothing happening. But you do still need to be a certain type of person, because you can't afford to be, nowadays people might be tempted to, look at phones or nod off, especially if you've been on it for hours and it's overnight, if nothing's happening. But the reality is you have to be able to react very quickly and stay at a certain level of sort of consciousness for a start, for that time. It's no good you've been sat on a job for 8 hours and the person comes out, and then one of the other people in your team says, I've just seen a guy that looks just like our target, but you've been watching the address the whole time. Oh yeah, I've been watching the address. No one's come out, having nodded off for 10 minutes, you totally missed him. And sometimes, that literally can have fatal consequences depending on what the job is. So, it sounds exciting. The reality is surveillance is 99% utter boredom, and either busting for the loo, being hungry, gagging for a drink, any of those things. And then 1%, of absolute chaos and, extreme excitement, and adrenaline feels like, it's about to burst your heart. It can really, really be a high level for a brief period of time, and it's being able to switch between those two. So anyway, it's simple. It's like most other, external jobs. You put an application in and you sort of be asked, well, why do you want to be surveillance, and what experience have you got? And quite often it's none, although actually prior to joining the police, I'd been a store detective, so both a uniform sort of security guard in shops and also a plainclothes store detective in quite a busy city. So I had a little bit of knowledge and understanding of what it might involve, or some of the sort of tips and tricks of the trade, but I had, no clue really compared to what the guys and girls knew that were on the teams already, because they were, fantastic at what they did, really, really good at what they did. So you put this application in, it goes through your line manager, which for most PCs will be a sergeant, who kind of adds their own comments if they think you're suitable or not. I mean, they might be able to stop it at that point, the sergeant, and say, I don't think they're suitable, but invariably they'll put it through and it'll go into a pool, and in a small force like I was at the time, probably 20 or 30 people perhaps applied, and there wasn't necessarily a job at the end of it either. It was this course, and then depending on how you got on, there might be some vacancies in the sort of county team, or even going forward a national team, but it might be that you sort of pass the course and then actually you come back to division and sort of do your normal day-to-day job. So I got through the paper sift and I was accepted onto an assessment day, which was off at headquarters for me. And when I turned up, there was about another dozen people, I suppose, there. And it was various things that were tested. Memory was a big part of it. So on a couple of occasions, they would show us videos, and it would just literally be either a video or a still shot of a table with maybe 10 everyday items on. So it'd be a paper clip, a rubber, a pencil, packet of cigarettes, a lighter, anything and everything you can think of would be on the table, and you'd get to see that for maybe 30 seconds. Then they would take it away and they would ask you to write down what you'd seen. Now, that can be incredibly difficult, and, not everyone can do that. So I presume that sifted a few out. So we had a few of those. Then we were played some videos of things happening. And again, could be absolutely random things. Person walking down the street with a bag of shopping, going into a couple of shops, crossing the road, Sometimes they're a bit more specific. They'd ask, tell us what you saw, what happened, but they might be a bit more specific. So they'd say, what was the colour of the car that came past when the person crossed the road? What colour was their shopping bag? Which shop did they go into? So it's just really to see sort of how observant you were and what your memory was like. So I went through those and answered a few of those. There was also some silhouettes. We were shown a series of car silhouettes and had to identify the make and model. There was quite a few of those. I think there was something like 50 odd maybe, different cars we were shown from all sorts of angles, side view, sort of quartering rear view, front on, all different directions. And again, they just wanted to know that, did you have a reasonable knowledge of cars, and were you able to pick them out from the silhouettes? I'm sure I didn't get them all right, but again, a vital skill in relation to surveillance. So anyway, I filled out the forms and did the best I could. It's all you can ever do, isn't it? Let's face it. And about a week or so later, I had a letter through to say I'd been successful on the assessment day and the application, and I was invited to start a course in, a month or two's time, a 3-week course. So I was quite excited at this. Didn't really know anyone that had been on surveillance, but as a young cop, I thought, oh, this will be exciting, and certainly the course was very, very good. So initially we met up, and there was about a dozen on the course. I recognised a few people from the sort of assessment day. Not everyone had got through, presumably, and you never got told how you did, but I obviously did okay, because I was accepted onto the course. And we had obviously a bit of a briefing, and they told us what it would involve, and they said it's going to be very long days, because that's part of the pressure. They didn't say this to us, but the reality is, when you're tired, you make mistakes, and they also want to see, when you're tired, you've been working long shifts, how do you fit in on a team? Are you snappy? Are you going to get into little stupid arguments with your colleagues? Because no one wants to sit there and work with someone who's going to be arguing with them when you're 20 hours in. Do you know what I mean? That was a long shift, but it wasn't unheard of. So they had a really good look at you, to be honest with you, and the course involved a lot of people that were on the actual surveillance team anyway. So they were kind of instructors, but they were also sort of, teaching you things as it went along. It was a really, really good course. Now you might think in your mind, surveillance, I've seen that on the telly. They have newspapers and they cut eye holes in the paper and then they peer through the paper, and always someone sat on a hill with a great big pair of binoculars, Well, probably not the papers thing. Sat on the hill with the binoculars, not impossible, yeah. But there's a lot of sort of stuff that happens on the telly, and again, it drives me mad on the police dramas and things, and you're like, it wouldn't happen like that. That is rubbish. I love how you see people that are doing surveillance on a car, and they're right behind it with a handheld radio in their hand, speaking and updating on the radio. I mean, that just wouldn't happen. The one thing I would say is, the guys and girls that do surveillance are absolutely fantastic at their job, and they very, very rarely get pinged, as we would call it, i.e. the target has realised they are being surveilled. That is incredibly rare because they're so good at their job. So what does a surveillance officer look like? Well, it's a good question, and the reality is obviously absolutely anything. But there's certain things they'd shy away. Now, probably in the application process, they would never admit to this, but I can almost guarantee that some people were shaved off that course because of how they looked. Because what they want is the absolute grey man. If you are very tall, very short, particularly muscular, you have a certain hairstyle, you dressed in a certain way. Now, obviously, clothes can be changed, but what they don't want is someone who stands out in any way at all. And so they're really looking for this person who just blends in, Mr. or Mrs. Average. They want as many females as they do males, because certainly if you're together, male and female together, that's great, because obviously you look like a couple. So that works really well in cars. But you can change clothes and appearances. There was always a sort of long-standing joke that sort of plainclothes firearms officers always look the same. They had almost a uniform. They would wear like Berghaus walking boots, jeans, a Berghaus fleece, and you could pick them out a mile off. And I have to say, kind of looking around some of the courses, they were right. That's how it looked. But the thing is that they do not want any sort of names or anything like that that's recognisable. Because we had a couple turn up, especially the young ones, and I was young at that time, but I was never a fashion victim like some of these people. They turned up in their best, tracksuit and their Adidas trainers, or their, whatever it was, Nike baseball cap or whatever they were wearing. The problem is that's all very well, and in certain areas you might blend in. But what you don't know is anything about your target. Now, for all you know, your target is like really into baseball caps or trainers or, a particular brand of something, Reebok or whatever it is. So you can imagine if you're wearing these latest sort of Gucci, Reebok trainers that are all the rage, and you're feeling all chuffy yourself because of how fashionable you are. You can imagine if you're surveilling someone and you're behind them in a town, especially a fairly small town centre, And there they go into, I don't know, music shop, and start looking round at, and this is obviously, you can tell how much I'm going back now, music shops with, records in and CDs and things. If you're in there with these trainers on and you're looking at your target, and more importantly, he's looking at you, if he's into those trainers, and he's into those sorts of things, he'll remember them. So now tomorrow or next week or next month, when he's in another town, in another store, in a supermarket or whatever, picking up cigarettes or whatever he's getting, if he then sees those trainers again, particularly if they're a bit unusual, they're going to stick in his mind. So that gets him thinking, and now he might sort of follow up from your shoes to your face. And, if he's switched on, he might be thinking, I've seen those trainers before. You don't see many of them about. Where did I see him? Think, a week ago. And then they'll look at you and think, I've seen this guy before. So if this is, a master criminal who is out doing their thing, and they're particularly switched on and surveillance aware, and they might be thinking, hang on a sec, this guy was behind me in that little village in the middle of nowhere. And now here he is again in another town a week later. Suddenly you are pinged, you are very much. We had what was called an exposure clock. So you could afford to walk past the target, once, but your exposure clock, would get a lot hotter. That person is, well sort of used to, or has very much seen you. Not a problem if you're not doing anything stupid, like walking down the road with a police radio in your hand, like you see on the telly. But, that person is now aware of you. So your exposure clock is at maximum, and what you can't afford to do is be seen again. So it might be, if you had a really high, long hit with someone, or for whatever reason, you might have had actual contact with them, you bumped into them, or worse still, they've spoken to you and had a really good look at you, you could never, ever be seen on that job again. You could never have any dealings up close with that person whatsoever. Because straight away they go, hang on a sec, I've seen this person before, So you need to be very, very careful. And we were, the first week of this 3-week course was all about sort of foot follows and very much in town centres and on foot. There was nothing to do with vehicles to start with. It was all about the sort of foot stuff. So you might think, well, that's easy. Well, it's easy in a bigger shop or a town. And, it won't just be one of you following, this person. It will be the whole dozen of you, maybe more. There'll be a lot of people following this person. And the control of that person, and by that I mean the person who is perhaps directly behind the target, will pass around very, very regularly between the team, because you can't afford to have, you following around the target literally sort of 6 feet behind them, and they cross the road and you cross the road, and they go in the shop and you go in the shop, and they come out and you come in. Do you know what I mean? It just doesn't work. So the whole idea is this person is passed around amongst the team. But what the instructors can do is make life really difficult for you. They can go out of their way to take you into awkward places. And what's an awkward place? Well, I can tell you that, if it's a female target you're following and they walk into an underwear shop and they start looking around at all the, sort of saucy lingerie, and me as a sort of 24-year-old male walking around feeling incredibly uncomfortable, that's the sort of places they'll take you to, because there's only so long you can hang around in one of those stores before, a member of staff's going to come up to you and go, hi, can I help you, and then you've got to come up with some cock and bull story about, I'm looking for my girlfriend, but the problem is, if your target is listening into this conversation, they may be clocking you, they're looking at you, they're listening to you, they've heard your voice, they've heard this story, Stories are okay, and you always need a cover story, but they have to be believable and they have to be sort of checkable. So the classic is, if we were onto vehicles and we were using, say, a builder's van, or a pretend builder's van, and we would have, a fluorescent jacket and a builder's hat slung in the front and a copy of the newspaper and a few old coffee cups, and a screwed up bacon sandwich sort of wrapper or whatever, all on the dashboard so it looked the part. Generally, we'd always use a plain van. You wouldn't have, Acme Builders on the side and a telephone number. We did occasionally do that. And if you had to do that, there better be someone sitting on the end of that telephone. And it can't be, the person who's following the target round, because if they're suspicious at all, if they're switched onto surveillance, they look at this and go, hang on a sec, I'm not sure about this van. I saw that last week, because they've remembered the name. Something stood out about them in that van. Same for vehicles. You can't afford to have, blacked out windows, lowered car with massive shiny chrome wheels, or anything that's going to stick in their memory. You equally need, the most plain, basic car in a grey colour, a dark colour, nothing that sort of attracts attention, no stickers on it, anything. Because if they pick up the phone and decide, you know what, I'm going to ring that builder, I don't trust it. If someone answers that phone, and they better answer that phone, there's no good them sort of then floundering when they say, hi, what sort of services do you offer? It can't be someone who knows nothing about building who goes, oh, well, we can like put bricks together and all sorts. It needs to be someone who has some knowledge in that area that goes, yeah, sure, well, what we offer is, a complete building service starting from, the architect, we can new build. Do you know what I mean? They need to be able to hold that conversation and be believable. And, and friendly, and taking details of the person, that backstory has to be believable and needs to be, sort of covered if that phone call comes in. So we would generally avoid things like that at all. So one of the things we talked about on that first week of the course was radio communications. You have to be able to speak to your team. Now that's a really difficult one, or it was then, because nowadays I would imagine it's a lot easier. We're used to seeing people with microphones in ears, sort of Bluetooth things from your car, with a dangling wire and a microphone on it, and you've got an earpiece in. That's quite common now for hands-free sort of car kits. Well, at the time it wasn't. So it was always very difficult to speak on a radio. We didn't, we weren't really carrying mobile phones, so you could maybe get away with pulling that phone out your pocket and updating on a radio. Like pretending like you're on your phone, because what would happen is the microphone for the radio would be buried under your clothing somewhere, and the button you press to speak on the radio would be on a long wire that almost certainly was threaded through, your trouser pocket, so that you just had your hand in your pocket, but you were able to press the button and talk just normally, and you had a skin-coloured earpiece in, and the mic was buried in your clothes, so outwardly there was no appearance, but it wouldn't be a curly mic, it wouldn't have like a curly wire going up to it like you're some protection officer for, a big movie star. It would be a wireless one, that had no external obvious sort of appearance. So obviously, if someone turns around, if your target turns around and looks straight at you while you're giving an update on the radio, they need to know why your lips are moving. Otherwise, you look like somebody who's just talking to themselves. And again, that is obviously going to arouse suspicion and also make them remember you. So if you're in a car, for example, you needed to be able to give an update on the radio, probably bobbing your head to some imaginary music, because if they see you in traffic and you're talking away to yourself, it's going to make them suspicious. But if you're moving your head, in rhythm to this imaginary song while you're giving your update, then that's your cover, and that's quite difficult to achieve. I never was particularly good at that, but it was one thing we could do. As I say, nowadays, probably a bit easier. So we talked some about awkward places, and I've got a story for you. So again, what other awkward places could you have? Well, sex shops. The city that I used to work in had a few, and again, they would walk you straight into a sex shop, and they would go and ask the most awkward questions. And again, as a young guy, who felt really out of sorts in these places, but you had to try and be casual and be relaxed and what have you. And a friend of mine who did his surveillance course in a big city, they'd love to take you into really busy places at rush hour, but they took him, and also, obviously you do surveillance at night, it's not just a day thing, so you could be going into bars and pubs and clubs, and you can't sit there with, a soft drink. It needs to look the part, so you'd have to come up with some scenario of what you were drinking in there. So a certain amount of drinking was allowed, very low level, because, if you're all sat in this hard drinking pub, with orange juice on the go all night, that might also attract suspicion. So in some scenarios, sort of low level drinking was allowed. But my friend was on his course, and he was from a public order team. He's a fit guy, was in the gym a lot, and the guy he was with was particularly muscly and sort of fit guy. Now I have to say, they looked pretty straight. They were straight blokes, they were wearing sort of straight clothes, and there was nothing about them that kind of appeared gay in any way. But the target headed straight for the biggest gay bar in the town. And unfortunately, that was going to make them really uncomfortable, classic sort of uncomfortable thing. So the target goes into the bar, they walked up, they knew what the bar was, and they found a big sort of Eastern European doorman step in front of them. And he said to them, look them up and down, thought probably that they didn't look very gay to him. And he kind of said, "Is gay bar," pointing to the bar behind him. And they were like, "Oh yeah, we know, yeah, we're all over that gay stuff. Yeah, me and him, we're a couple, And he kind of looks them up and down as if to say, "I don't think so, But he was like, well, okay, in you go, So they walked in, and my friend was saying, he had a really uncomfortable time of it in this bar, I mean, for some people it wouldn't be an issue at all, but these guys, testosterone-fueled young guys from a public order team where everything is, alpha male, they found it very difficult, and that obviously was the idea. So that was one of the places they got taken into. Trains and underground trains particularly, really, really difficult to do surveillance on. You have to be thinking ahead. Now, I'm not going to give too much away here about any sort of tactics, but I can give you a little flavour. So on the train, you're going to need people on that train for sure. You're going to need people to stay on the platform, because there's a chance the person might get off at the last second, particularly if they're trying to do anti-surveillance. So you're going to need to leave one of the team on the platform. When they first go into the train station, you need someone in the queue behind them if they're queuing up for a ticket, or if they go into a ticket machine, because we have to clock where is that person buying a ticket to, either hearing them ask for, a single to London, or seeing it on a computer screen, I'm going to, Heathrow Airport or wherever it is, because they immediately need to be putting that out to the team, because now you've got someone in a car somewhere looking at a map, seeing where that train line goes to, because again, you've now got to get cars leapfrogging ahead and having someone at every single station on that train line where that train stops, because there's a risk that, if you've got no one on that platform and no one in the car park, that train stops, we don't know where this person's going to. They might have bought a ticket to Heathrow. It doesn't mean they're going there. It might be they're going to stop, 3 stops before and get off. So you have to cover all those options. So by now, this is where the panic comes. You've got cars driving fast to get ahead of this train and be at these platforms and waiting when it comes in. So trains is quite a difficult one, and as I say, the favourite trick of an instructor on a course will be, let's take them in rush hour, because it's going to make it so much more difficult with a lot of people about. So first week was very much on foot and in busy town centres and awkward places like we've discussed. Weeks 2 and 3 were very much about cars. Now nowadays they've got airwave radios, and they're really secure. As far as I know, they kind of pretty much can't be patched into. But when I was doing this course, the radios were a bit rubbish. So the surveillance team had a complete different language they could use that no one would know what they were saying. Now again, they might still use it, so I'm not going to give you the details of what it's about. But for example, if I was following someone, I might put up an update of Papa's 5-3 or Papa's 5-5 with 5-3 blue yellow 6. That means nothing to anyone. Although you can imagine if you're walking past a member of the public saying it, they're going to be like, what the hell? But invariably that would be said in a car. Now you'd be thinking, well, what did you just say? But for anyone who knows the code, they would know that I've just said I am the control person, i.e. I am directly behind that vehicle, or I'm maybe 1 or 2 cars back from it. So I'm the one who's got the eyeball on the target. And I'd be telling the team where I was heading for roughly. As I say, I'm not going to go into how the breakdown of that code is, but basically if our radio system was hacked into, the fact that we were talking in code, no one would ever know what you were saying. So that was quite clever. And so this course went on, and we were taught a lot of tactics. A full surveillance team could easily be 12 people or 12 cars with 2 in each. At the time we didn't have GPSs. You'd be saying, well, why didn't we put tracking devices in the cars? Well, this was all about a surveillance course, but obviously that was an option. And certainly we would say, if there was a particularly high level target, or there was someone who was very good at anti-surveillance, we would, and the term we would use, we would lump up their car. We would put a lump on their car, and that would be a tracking device. And then you'd be able to sit a couple of miles off with a laptop following them on a screen. It was quite rare then because it was new technology. Nowadays it's probably a lot easier, and they possibly do all surveillance like it. Although you're still going to need eyes on the target, because you never know, what they're going to do. They might meet someone, they might pass someone something, particularly if it was a firearm or drugs or something, your whole case could sort of hinge on it. And you also need to be in a position to actually potentially get some sort of video footage of that, because you need the evidence. Ideally, yes, you seeing it with your colleague might be enough, but even better evidence is if you can film it. So quite difficult to achieve. And what we did was, on the final few days of the course, final 3 days, once we got to the end of the course, they said, there's a target coming in. He's flying in to the airport from Belfast, and here's his picture. He comes in on this flight over to you. Follow him for 3 days, and then report back. And that was it. That was the final exercise. So we sat at the airport, and we all had this guy's photo. And by now, we were thinking we were pretty good at this surveillance lark. And that's what we did, basically. The guy came off the plane, he came through the airport, then and they incorporated it all. He got on the train, he went into a busy city at rush hour, then he got a hire vehicle, he got in his vehicle, then he went to a hotel, then he went for a walk through the town centre. Yes, of course, he visited underwear shops, sex shops, almost certainly went in a gay bar as well, from what I remember. He just, all these awkward places, the whole lot was thrown at you for this final exercise. So we followed him for 3 days, and both in vehicle, on foot, into restaurants, bars, shops, you name it. And we stuck with him. And then at the end of the 3-day exercise, basically they told us that is the end of it. Now, we'd been working, minimum of 12-hour days, sometimes 15 or 20 hours. So for 3 weeks, we were absolutely hanging out at this point. We were very, very tired. And of course, that's exactly what they wanted, for us to make mistakes and, like I say, be bitching at each other, basically. So we were looked at very closely, and at the end of the course, we were invited into this room, and the dozen of us sat round in like a horseshoe shape. And then the target was that we'd been following for those last 3 days through the airport and what have you, came into the room, and he sat down and he explained who he was. And he was an undercover operative from Northern Ireland, and this was the time during the Northern Ireland troubles were at their height. And he said, pleased to meet you. I've seen some of you about. I'm just going to detail what I know. Now, like I say, remember, we're 3 weeks into course here, so we think we're the daddies. We are good at this stuff, and I doubt he even saw us. So he got this little notebook out, and he opened up his notebook, and he started at one side of the room, and he said, okay, so I got off the plane, and I came through the airport, and he gave a time, 15:07. I saw you, and he pointed to someone in the room, and you were with her. You were wearing a red jumper, he had a black jacket on. So, we're kind of thinking, oh no, he's clocked a couple of people, So it would go on. Anyway, he would continue on literally through the 3 days, minute by minute. And then we went on to so-and-so bar. I picked the car up. I saw you in a red Vauxhall Astra, and the registration number was so-and-so. And then you got out of, a blue Mondeo registration, such and such, and you followed me for 10 minutes until I went into so-and-so shop, and then you passed the eyeball over to so-and-so, this is how it went on. And a couple of us initially were feeling smug that we hadn't been picked out. Let me tell you, by the end of that half an hour debrief, every single person had been picked out, probably 3 or 4 times each. All the vehicles we'd use, all the registrations, what clothes we were wearing, everything. And we were completely crestfallen, it was a real sort of shock to us. But this guy was good. And at the end of it, he said, look, don't be too disheartened. He said, if I get this wrong, it's my life on the line. If I get this wrong in Belfast, I'm a dead man. So I have to be good at what I do. And that was echoed by the instructors. So he then went on his way. And basically we were informed of who had and hadn't passed the course. We were individually taken into a room to be told. Now, out of the dozen of us, I think maybe 2 or 3 were considered good enough to go on to the county team and possibly onto a national team. They were good. And to be honest with you, amongst us, we knew who the good ones were. I also knew it probably wasn't me. So I was told that I passed the course, but I wasn't good enough to go on to the county team or the national team. They said we could use you locally to assist, but generally, you're not for us, So it was a bit disheartening, to say the least. But the reality was, they said, your problem is you look like a cop. You stand tall, you have a short haircut, you walk around and you're kind of eyes about. These other people that have passed, not only are they good at what they do, but they have the ability to slouch around and generally look disinterested and have the total opposite appearance of a police officer. But unfortunately, I didn't. I walked around standing up straight, looking about with my short haircut, and generally looked like someone who was, sort of not on a mission, but I just found it very difficult to relax, and I wasn't really aware of it until I'd been on this course. So it was quite interesting to be told it, although a little, as I say, I felt like I'd let myself down a bit, but at the end of the day, it's not for everyone, and I would go on to do a lot of surveillance, but on different teams and in different ways, and we'll cover that in another episode. But it's a fantastic course, really, really interesting. I've got the utmost respect for the people that pass and work on those surveillance teams day in, day out, I can almost guarantee that if you were being surveilled, you would be unaware of it. They're very, very good at what they do. And I was certainly to do a lot of work with them when I worked on the firearms. But we'll come on to that another time. So there we go, episode 25. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was interesting, a little bit different from normal. Next week I go back to division and do the normal police work, and I've got a couple of goodies for you. And then very shortly after that, we're going to get into some of the firearm stuff. Because I started doing some of the armed courses. But thanks for listening. Thanks for the downloads. Please tell anyone else you think might be interested in Police Stories podcast. Going to continue on for some time yet. You may or may not be pleased to hear. But I'll speak to you again soon. Thanks very much. Cheers. Bye.